So one of the more interesting things about Dune Awakening is their faction system and their endgame focused Landsraad system, and how this is going to tie back into every piece of content in the game, and it's going to affect every single player on every world. But one of the main reasons I wanted to go over this in this video is because we do already know that there is going to be a third faction added after launch of the game, and it's really interesting how they're going about this, and there's also some theories about what this third faction is going to be. But first, I think we need to quickly go over the faction and Landsraad system. So some point in Dune Awakening, you'll be able to join one of the two factions, the Atreides or the Harkonnen, and joining either one of these factions will actually unlock a bit of new things. First off, there'll be a vendor for them where you can get gear, you can get their different building sets, you'll get different objectives or quest lines to go through, and then you'll also be taking part in the Landsraad on behalf of whatever faction you choose. Now you can betray that faction and join the other, but it sounds like after you do that, you either won't be able to go back or it'll take a lot to allow you to go back. And another pretty interesting part about the faction system is that even though you're part of the same faction, when you're in the deep desert, you will still be fighting and going against people of your own faction. The only people you won't be fighting are your friends, people in your group, and your guildmates. Even though there will be friendly fire on, but everybody else, no matter if they're in your faction or not, they will be trying to fight you. You're not going to be any different than people of the opposite faction. But because of the Landsraad system, there may actually be some reasons for the people of your faction to try to group up and help each other a bit more, especially in the deep desert, even though you can still just openly fight each other and there's no consequences for that. Now, the Landsraad system is one of the main pieces of the endgame. This is essentially a big objective board that changes every week, and you have to go find all of these different NPCs throughout the world that will give you their objectives, and if you complete their objectives as a faction first, you will get their slot on the Landsraad board. It's kind of like this really big bingo board. Now, I don't want to go into all of the specifics of the Landsraad system, but everybody that partakes in an objective, you will get some amount of rewards, depending on how much your specific guild helped with completing that objective. And as the different factions complete more and more objectives, someone will end up winning the Landsraad for that week. And once a faction wins a Landsraad for the week, they get to choose a server rule or a world rule for the next week. So let's say the Atreides win this week and they have a handful of options that they get to vote on. And it's pretty much all the guilds that helped in the Landsraad that get to vote on it. But the more that a guild helped with winning the Landsraad, the more essentially points they get to use to vote on the next week's rule. And these rules can be really crazy. Some of the ones they've shown off are full loot PvP in the deep desert. Dune Awakening doesn't normally have full loot PvP. You drop all of your resources but not your gear. So this would be full loot PvP for a week in the deep desert. There's things like reducing the crafting cost by like 25% for your whole faction. There's things like opening up a unique or exotic vendor for your faction for that week where you can buy like higher tier gear and unique items. There are just a bunch of different server rules that you'll be able to vote between for that week. I don't think you can vote between all of them. I think it'll give your faction a handful to select from for that week. So the Landsraad and the factions are actually going to play a really big part just in your overall endgame objectives and connecting to any piece of content throughout the game, but also giving your overarching world these massive server rules for weeks at a time. Now, with all of that information we just went over, we can now go into the third faction because we know of the two factions that are going to be on launch, but there is going to be a third faction the developers have talked about before where they want the third faction to be the limiter or the balancing faction between the other two. So what can happen in a lot of games that have two factions, especially when you're kind of server based, which is essentially what worlds are in Dune Awakening, one faction can end up being really strong, and as one faction becomes stronger and stronger, a lot of people will also want to join that faction because it's just a much better experience to not get destroyed because the other faction is so much stronger. So they want to introduce this third faction that limits and balances the other two. And this was explained that let's say you're doing the Landsraad for the week, that if the two factions are very balanced when one wins the Landsraad, that's the only way that third faction is going to get any rewards from the Landsraad. So let's say you need like 6 in a row on the Landsraad board for your faction to win. maybe the third faction won't get any rewards unless both the factions are like 5 to 6. So very close when the Landsraad is finally completed for that week. But this also brings into question, how is that going to work with voting on the server rule? Maybe if they're close, the third faction just gets to vote on the server rule with whichever faction wins. Or maybe there's going to be like separate world rules that if the third faction makes the other two balance, that the third faction gets to vote on this like additional rule for the world for that week or something like that. But the biggest theory of what this third faction is going to be is the Fremen. Now, we don't actually know where the Fremen are in Dune Awakening. Dune Awakening is kind of a what-if scenario, story-wise and lore-wise, but in the lore of Dune Awakening, at least on launch and at least at the start of the game, we don't know really where the Fremen are. I think you do meet some Fremen early on technically, but we don't know like where their whole civilization is because there's millions and millions of Fremen supposed to be on Arrakis. So a big theory with this is that we're going to be going through the game, going through the stories and everything, and then some future update is going to add in the Fremen and add them in as a third faction. This can actually work really well because some of the information we previously went over. Because first off, the Fremen would generally be enemies of both the Atreides and the Harkonnen in this version of the Dune lore, because Paul Atreides isn't there to bring in the Fremen to his side. So the Fremen could be there as kind of the faction that just fights both of the other ones and doesn't want either of them getting too strong, so they try to keep them balanced. And then you also kind of have the faction vendors where you can get their building sets, their armor sets, and all that type of stuff, to where you could then get all of the Fremen specific things, which would be another really cool aesthetic for the Dune universe and for Dune Awakening specifically. There is some other theories, like maybe it'll be the Sardaukar or some other faction specifically under the Emperor, but I generally think it's going to be the Fremen. The Fremen are going to be a big part of Dune Awakening. They are a very big part of the Dune universe, and we do also know that it seems like people at Legendary who Funcom have worked with to make this game, and those are the people that have made the new Dune movies. It seems like they didn't want Dune Awakening to have Fremen in at the start of the game because they didn't know how the timelines would be stacking up, because if they're releasing these movies, they wouldn't potentially want the game to have these Fremen be in there or have something potentially spoiled by being in Dune Awakening when the movies are still coming out or haven't shown something about the Fremen. Even though obviously you could go read the books and the movies are actually pretty lore accurate to the books, I think a lot of people still haven't read them and they didn't really want the possibility of something being spoiled. So they wanted the Fremen to kind of not be in the game at the launch or not be super in the game at the launch, and then they could add them later down the road in a future update. That's also one of the reasons I think it's going to be Fremen as a third faction. It will just work very well, and they're such a big part of the Dune universe. It would be really cool for the players to be able to join the Fremen as the third faction. And this would also give the developers opportunities to add in a bunch of new Fremen specific things. Like one of the things that I've heard a lot of players want is the sand walking. So the specific way they kind of walk on the sand to not attract sandworms. A lot of players kind of want that as a potential mechanic. And what's a better way to add that than when you add in the Fremen, the people who actually do it and teach other people how to do it, then adding that in when you add that faction in. And this could be definitely a much bigger update that adds a lot of other things based around the Fremen as well. So I generally think this is the way they're going to go about it, because it just kind of all lines up really well for everything they're trying to do. But that's all I want to go over, so thanks for watching.